You have probably been in this moment, maybe an argument, maybe a quiet night alone, where someone asked you to prove why you love someone. And you tried to list out reasons, you tried to reach out for words, and when you were done, it sounded quite nothing like what it actually felt. That gap between what you felt and what you can prove, that is not a weakness. That is the most honest thing about you. And today we're going to be talking about that gap. For your heart, with all its messiness, can maybe reach some places which your mind can never even dream of. Blaise Pascal was one of the most impressive mathematical brains of the 17th century. He invented early computing machines. He laid the foundation of probability theory. So we know that he was not a man afraid of logic. However, he said something quite striking that moved and puzzled people for centuries. He said, "Your heart knows reasons which reason knows nothing of." I mean, think about what it takes for a mathematician to say that. He was not someone who distrusted minds. He was someone who pushed it to its limits and then hit a wall. Pascal was pointing at something real here. He was saying that there is a category of knowledge, the kind that moves you, the kind that transforms you, maybe the kind that lets you let down your ego and say, "I believe." The kind that logic cannot manufacture. You can argue your way to a conclusion, but you cannot argue your way to love. You cannot debate your way to faith. And you cannot calculate your way to meaning. At some point, your mind has to stop and your heart has to begin its work. Across history, the Sufi tradition has been sitting with this truth, not as a philosophical puzzle, but rather as a lived reality. Mevlana Jalaluddin Rumi, the 13th century poet and mystic who changed the world with his words, said something really interesting about this. He said that there is the knowledge of the scholar, which is built word by word, argument by argument, book by book. And then there is another kind of knowledge. Mevlana Rumi in his Mathnawi says, "There is a kind of knowledge, one who has memorized Quran or scholarly text. But there is another kind of knowledge which is superior, the heart's knowledge, which is divine." Mevlana Rumi is not outright dismissing scholarship. In fact, he was one of the most brightest and famous scholars who ever lived in his era. However, what he's saying is that knowledge or scholarship is a vehicle and not a destination. The Sufi path has understood something that the modern culture has almost entirely forgotten. That the deepest truths about existence are not problems to be solved, but rather realities to be experienced. You don't think your way to God, but rather you experience your way to God. You live your way to God, you feel your way to God, and you love your way to God. Now, fast forward to the 20th century, the famous Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung, who was the father of analytical psychology, who spent his entire life studying the interior world of human beings, found something quite interesting. He found that the more we suppress our non-rational, the instinctive intuitions of the human heart, the more chances of those emotions later erupting in destructive ways. He wrote, "Your vision will become clear only when you look into your own heart. Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakes." Jung was not writing for a religious audience. He was writing for the Western world, which is void of spirituality. And yet he arrived at the same conclusion as Rumi did, centuries apart, the same thing. And this is not a coincidence. This is a pattern that the human experience speak the same thing, even if it is centuries apart. The modern world tells us, measure it, test it, and prove it, and then something is real. Well, that can work if you're building bridges or skyscrapers or technology. But when you're asking serious questions like, why am I here? What am I supposed to do? What is the purpose of life? Then you need an entirely different instrument altogether. So where does this leave us? The mind and the heart are not enemies, and it was never meant to be. The mind is extraordinary. It maps the universe, it connects ideas, it builds system. But eventually, it is a tool. The Sufi tradition speaks of your heart as a mirror. And if a mirror has to perform at its finest quality, it has to be clean. And if your heart is cluttered with ego, with resentment, with the noise of ambition and fear, it cannot reflect anything clearly. Pascal proved theorems. Rumi wrote poetry that still makes people weep, even after 800 years. And Jung was someone who studied the interior world of the human beings. Yet all of them arrived at one single conclusion that were identical. And that proves us that what we just talked about is worth sitting with and giving it a thought. The next time your heart is tied with the knots of confusion or uncertainty and you're trying to make sense of something, maybe grief, faith, love, hope, whatever it is, maybe the question that you have to ask yourself is not, how do I find my reason through this? But rather, am I willing to find my way through this? So as we realized, the heart does know some things, some secrets that the mind is still learning to catch up to. So give it a chance.